Ukrainian drones came out of the dark over the Kerch Strait and went straight for two ships almost nobody outside a naval intelligence desk had ever heard of. The Volga and the Vyatka. Not corvettes, not frigates, not the kind of gray warship that makes for a good thumbnail. Cable ships. Vessels built to lay and lift and repair the fiber optic lines that run along the floor of the Black Sea, and if you know what those lines feed, you already understand why Kiev sent an elite unit to burn them at the waterline instead of something that shoots back. That is the part Russia would rather you skipped past. The ships that got hit weren't there to fight. They were there to listen. And when Ukraine put fire on them at the Zaliv Shipyard, it wasn't reaching for a headline about a naval base. It was reaching for the nervous system underneath the whole Black Sea theater. This is bigger than a burning hull, and it moves faster than most people watching realize. Because what happened in the hours and days after that strike is the story Moscow is trying very hard to keep off your screen. It's the night of June 26th, and the drones are already inbound before the air defense crews near the Strait have finished sorting real targets from decoys. By the time the sun comes up over occupied Crimea, Ukraine's security service is claiming a large fire at Kerch, and Russia is admitting it just tried to swat down one of the biggest drone waves of the entire war. That's the timestamp to hold in your head. And I'm Professor Alex Moscow. If you want the version of these events that treats you like an adult instead of a mark, take a second and subscribe because we're going deep on this one. Now stay with me because the strike itself is only the door. What's behind it is a slow-motion siege that's been building for months, and it's finally showing on the balance sheet. Let me tell you what these two ships actually are, because it reframes everything. The Volga and the Vyatka are Project 15,310 vessels. On paper, they're cable-laying ships, utility craft, the kind of thing that lays, lifts, and repairs underwater fiber optic lines. Boring, if you stop reading there. But open-source naval analysts have tied this class of ship to something Russia doesn't advertise: a seabed hydroacoustic surveillance network, the sort of system built to sit on the floor of the sea and monitor what moves across it. Submarines, drones, anything that passes overhead in the water column. If that link holds, then these weren't support boats. They were the maintenance crews for Russia's underwater eyes and ears in the Black Sea. You don't sink a warship to blind a fleet. You sink the ship that keeps the sensors alive. And the moment you frame it that way, the target selection stops looking random and starts looking surgical. Ukraine reportedly hit them at the Zaliv Shipyard in Kerch. Same yard Ukraine has struck before. Same stretch of coast that sits right next to the one piece of infrastructure Vladimir Putin treats like a personal trophy, the Kerch Bridge. So already we've got a strike on undersea surveillance vessels at a strategically loaded shipyard, a stone's throw from the most politically sensitive span in the entire war. And it came bundled with something else. Ukrainian sources also claimed damage to components of an S-400 air defense system guarding the Strait, plus a hit on a nearly finished cargo passenger ferry called the Petropavlovsk. 3 different kinds of target in one operation: surveillance, air defense, logistics. That's not a raid. That's a message with 3 sentences in it. Now I want to be straight with you, because that's the whole point of this channel. These are Ukrainian claims. Ukraine's security service put out the statement, credited its Alpha Special Operations Unit, and described a large fire. Russia has not confirmed the ships are gone. And a fire in a photo is not the same as a vessel that will never sail again. Wartime damage claims run hot on both sides. And the honest answer this early is that the full picture depends on satellite imagery and technical assessment that takes days, sometimes weeks, to settle. So hold the word destroyed loosely. What we can say with confidence is that the strike happened, that it landed on this specific class of ship, and that it came wrapped inside a much larger night. Russia's own defense ministry said it intercepted hundreds of drones across more than a dozen regions, reaching Moscow, the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, and Crimea itself. One of the heaviest single-night barrages Kyiv has thrown since the invasion began. That's the frame. Not one lucky drone, a wall of them, launched the same night, with the Kerch ships as one prize inside a much wider swing. And here's why that timing matters, because it's not a coincidence. Hours before that barrage went up, Ukraine's president stood up and told the world he'd approved a 40-day operation. His words were about compelling Russia toward the negotiating table through pressure. Not a single dramatic blow, but 40 days of sustained, grinding, everywhere at once pressure. Think about what that actually signals. Kyiv didn't say, "We're going to win a battle." Kyiv said, "We're going to make the next month unbearable," on a clock. The Kerch strike wasn't the operation, it was day one of the operation. So when you hear Ukrainian drones hit a naval base in the Kerch Strait, the correct reaction isn't "big night," it's "what's the plan this is the opening move of?" And that plan has a name and a shape, and it's the thing Moscow really doesn't want discussed out loud. The shape of it is an island. That's not my metaphor, it's Kyiv's stated goal, straight from Ukraine's own defense minister, who has said openly that the aim is to turn Crimea into an island, cut it off, isolate the peninsula from the Russian mainland until holding it becomes more trouble than it's worth. Another Ukrainian official put it in blunter terms weeks ago, that hell was beginning, that logistics were being cut, that Crimea was being isolated. Sit with that phrasing for a second because it tells you the theory of victory here has quietly changed. For most of this war, the assumption was that Crimea would have to be stormed, retaken meter by meter, at a cost in men that made the whole idea feel like a fantasy. That's not the plan on the table anymore. The plan on the table is to make Crimea impossible to supply, impossible to defend economically, impossible to live in for the occupying force, and let the occupation rot from the inside. Wither on the vine. You don't kick down the door, you cut the water, the power, the fuel, and the road, and you wait. And that is exactly what started showing up in the days after the Kerch strike, which is where this story turns from a military operation into something you can measure in rubles and gas tanks. Because look at what happened next. Within days, the Moscow-appointed authorities in Crimea declared a state of emergency. Read that again. Russia's own installed officials, on the peninsula Putin calls the crown jewel of the whole invasion, declared an emergency. They halted fuel sales to ordinary civilians. Gasoline got rationed down to almost nothing for private drivers, reserved, according to residents, for emergency services, police, firefighters, utilities, and businesses locked into existing contracts. Regular people were left standing in the heat, and in some places there weren't even lines anymore, because there was simply nothing to line up for. There are accounts of Crimeans forming groups of 10 just to game the QR code system for a shot at 20 liters of gas. 20 liters. That's about 5 gallons, split 10 ways in hope. Rolling blackouts spread. Power substations went dark. And this is peak tourist season on a peninsula whose economy leans hard on summer visitors, hotels, guest houses, wineries, tour operators, all watching bookings evaporate as the explosions and the shortages made the place unlivable for anyone with a choice. One man told a reporter he made a nearly day-long drive into southern Russia just to stockpile enough gasoline to evacuate his family if it came to that. His kids, he said, hear the explosions constantly. Electricity and water rationed. He doesn't know when it ends. That's the human texture underneath the phrase, isolation campaign. That's what turn it into an island looks like from a kitchen table in Yalta. And the bridge, Putin's bridge, the Kerch Bridge, became a monument to the whole problem. Ukraine hit oil depots and radar installations near it. By the end of that week, traffic across the span had ground down to a near halt, with reports of a backlog running past 2,000 vehicles and waits stretching for hours. Russia's answer was almost theatrical. Satellite images caught smoke-generating vehicles crawling across the bridge, pumping out clouds to hide the roadway from the drones that everyone now expects. Think about the image for a second. The prestige project, the ribbon Putin personally cut, now wrapped in artificial smoke, ringed by anti-aircraft guns, choked with a 2,000-vehicle queue, while Russian military bloggers openly fret in their own channels about the next strike on the bridge itself. That's not the posture of a power in control of a peninsula. That's the posture of a power trying to keep a lid on. So let's talk about the money, because that's where the real story lives, and it's the part that should genuinely change how you see this war. The fuel crisis didn't stay penned inside Crimea. It spread. Reporting puts the shortage across roughly 25 Russian regions and multiple occupied territories. Long lines at pumps not just on the peninsula but in Moscow itself, in the prosperous capital, people waiting hours to fill up, some pumps running completely dry. And Russia's response tells you how deep the hole is. Moscow started importing gasoline, shipping in tens of thousands of tons of petrol from India, and reportedly planning to bring in hundreds of thousands of tons a month from wherever it can find it, Stop and hold that. Russia, one of the largest oil producers on the planet, importing gasoline. That's like a wheat farmer buying bread at the store because his own kitchen caught fire. The country that funds this entire war on energy revenue is now paying to bring refined fuel back across its own borders because Ukrainian drones have been methodically knocking out its refining capacity, strike after strike, in quick succession, timed so the repairs never quite catch up. Putin himself acknowledged the shortage in public, and then, in the same breath, insisted it wasn't a serious problem and that the situation was under control. When the man at the top has to personally go on record to tell you the crisis isn't a crisis, that's usually the tell that it is. And now here's the piece that reframes the entire war. The thing I keep coming back to when I look at these numbers. The economics of how Ukraine is doing this are lopsided in a direction that should keep Russian planners up at night. Back in 2024, when Ukraine first leaned into long-range strikes, it launched something like 110 long-range drones into Russia across the whole push. This year, that figure has already blown past 3,000, according to a Ukrainian foundation that tracks it. From 110 to 3,000 plus. That's not an escalation, that's a phase change. And the reason it's possible is cost. Ukraine is fielding drones it builds itself, at home, for a fraction of what the fancy Western missiles run. Analysts point to counter-bridge drones priced under $50,000 a unit and compare that to a Storm Shadow cruise missile that runs around $2 million. Under $50,000 versus $2 million. And the cheap ones are made in Ukraine, which means no waiting on a foreign parliament to approve a shipment, no political strings attached to whether you're allowed to hit a particular target on a particular day. Ukraine can just build more. Every night. That's the asymmetry Russia can't easily solve with more air defense, because air defense is expensive and the drones are cheap. And when a $50,000 machine forces you to spend a multi-million-dollar interceptor, or worse, forces you to move an entire air defense battery away from somewhere else to cover the gap, the math is bleeding you even when you win the engagement. Which brings me back to that S-400 hit near the Strait, because it fits a pattern that's easy to miss if you only watch the explosions. Ukraine has been deliberately going after Russia's air defense shield around Crimea, the radars, the launchers, the command pieces, before reaching for the higher value targets underneath. Peel the shield, then strike what the shield was protecting. And every time Russia loses a piece of that shield, it faces the same ugly choice: accept more exposure or pull systems in from somewhere else to plug the hole. Kyiv has openly noted that Russia's been dragging air defense toward Moscow and toward the bridge, which means those systems aren't somewhere else, covering something else. The strike campaign isn't only destroying things, it's forcing Russia to constantly choose what it can afford to defend, and to keep making that choice under a clock. That's a different kind of warfare than most people picture. It's not about taking ground. It's about making the enemy spend interceptors, spend fuel, spend political capital, spend attention, until the whole occupation becomes a line item that won't stop growing. And the days right after Kerch prove the campaign didn't pause to admire its own work. It kept moving. Ukraine's security service claimed strikes on hangars at the Saki airfield holding Russian Su-30 fighter jets, aircraft valued somewhere between $30 and $50 million each, with reports of multiple drone hits, and it was the second time in a week that same airfield got worked over. Around the same stretch, there were strikes reported on an S-300/S-400 position near Kerch, and on electrical substations in central Crimea. Then, into early July, satellite data flagged fires at 2 more power substations in western Crimea, one of them a primary high-voltage node for that whole side of the peninsula, with monitors assessing a probable strike as the cause. So trace the line for a second. The naval ships at Kerch, the state of emergency, the fuel halt, the bridge backlog, the fighter jet hangars, the air defense sites, the substations, and then more substations. This isn't a series of unrelated headlines. It's one continuous act of strangulation executed on the 40-day schedule Kyiv announced out loud, and the Kerch strike you clicked on was just the moment it broke into the open. So what are they not telling you? They're not telling you that the naval story is really an infrastructure story. The burning ships make a great thumbnail, but the ships are almost beside the point. What Ukraine is actually attacking is the ability to keep Crimea plugged into Russia at all. The fuel, the power, the road, the ferries, the bridge, the refineries feeding it, and yes, the undersea sensors that let Russia see what's coming across the water. And they're not telling you how cheap it's become to do this, because that number, 110 drones 2 years ago, more than 3,000 now, at 50 grand a copy against $2 million alternatives, is the single most uncomfortable fact in the whole picture for anyone betting on Russia simply outlasting Ukraine through sheer mass. The old assumption was that Russia's depth would win a long war. The drone economics quietly flip that. When the cheaper side can strike the more expensive side's most valuable assets, night after night, on infrastructure that takes months to repair and moments to break, depth starts to look less like an advantage and more like a longer list of things to defend. Now, I don't want to sell you a fantasy either, and this is where the honest analyst has to slow down. None of this means Crimea is falling next week. The Kerch Bridge is damaged but not destroyed. It's been hit before, in 2022 and again in 2023, and Russia repaired it both times and kept it running at reduced capacity, ringed now with guns and smoke and nets and maritime obstacles. Russia is importing fuel, rerouting supply, leaning on price caps and export bans to hold the domestic situation together, and Putin is betting he can absorb the pain longer than Ukraine can keep the pressure on. The state of emergency in Crimea has no end date attached, which cuts both ways. It signals real strain, but it also signals a regime settling in to endure rather than fold. And every claim of a destroyed ship or a wrecked battery deserves that same cold caveat. Wartime accounting is unreliable until the imagery confirms it, and a fire is not a funeral. So the responsible read isn't Russia is collapsing. The responsible read is Russia is now paying, visibly and publicly, a price it spent years pretending it would never have to pay. And the trend line on that price is pointing the wrong way for Moscow. And that's the thread I keep pulling on. For years, the conversation about Crimea was frozen in one shape. Either Ukraine storms it in blood, or it stays Russian forever, and both of those felt equally impossible, so nobody moved. What the Kerch strike and everything after it suggests is a third door nobody was really looking at. You don't have to take the peninsula if you can make holding it cost more than it's worth. You don't have to win the beach if you can turn off the lights, drain the tanks, jam the bridge, and blind the sensors until the occupying force is spending all its energy just staying supplied. That's a slower theory of victory, less cinematic. It won't give you a single triumphant day, but it might be the more dangerous one for Moscow, precisely because there's no obvious moment to counter, no single blow to absorb and recover from, just 40 days, and then presumably another 40, of everything getting a little harder, a little more expensive, a little less sustainable, until one day the arithmetic of occupation stops working. Here's the question I can't shake, and I'll leave it with you. If the fastest way to lose a war isn't losing a battle, but slowly discovering that holding your greatest prize has quietly become the most expensive thing you own, how long does a leader keep paying for a trophy before he admits it was never worth the price? This is Professor Alex. I'll see you in the next one.